Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. And I'm just going to do a very brief review of the topic that we discussed last week, and then we'll go forward and we'll be in the same topic for a little while. So let me just go back to essentially the Mishnah, which was on Mem Aleph on the base, 41b. So the Mishnah started with a fairly simple halacha that said at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, even on a Shabbos, they used to take lulav and esrog. But since there was a problem in carrying in the streets, they used to bring the lulav and esrog to the shuls on Friday afternoon. And the next morning, they would take their lulav and esrog from the tables where they had left them, and they would be mekayim the mitzvah of arba minim. Nowadays, we don't take lulav and esrog when Sukkot falls on Shabbos, but they used to. The Mishnah also, at the end, brought in a halacha, which is what we are going to discuss further today. Before I discuss the second halacha of the Mishnah, just expand on the first. The first day of Sukkot, when the Shabbos falls on the first day of Sukkot, the Mishnah had said that when people bring their lulavim and esrogim to shul on the Friday afternoon, then the next day, which is the Shabbos, when they come to shul, they need to identify their own personal lulavim and esrogim rather than just taking the first one that comes to hand. And they have to do that because on the first day of Sukkot, there is a mitzvah of lochem, that the lulav and esrog, the arba minim, needs to belong to the person who's doing the mitzvah. So therefore, he has to identify his own. If he can't identify his own, he may have a bit of a problem. Of course, that problem is resolvable, as we'll see in a moment. But if he can find his own and take his own, then at least he's using his own, and he's mekayim the mitzvah of first day of Sukkot. The Gemara then said on this, well, supposing you haven't, supposing you've only got one lulav or one esrog, or you can't find your own, what do you do on the first day of Sukkot? Not on a Shabbos, but any time, if you need your own, and it isn't your own. So the Gemara introduced us to the concept of matana al manas lahachzir, that you can give a gift to the person who wants to make a mitzvah, make a bracha, but he hasn't got his own. And that gift you can make conditional on the fact that he will return the lulav and esrog to you, because you'll need it. You don't want him to run away with your lulav and esrog, so you may wish to make a condition that he returns it to you afterwards. And he can then perform his mitzvah if he's received it from you as a gift, because it belongs to him as a gift. Now, the Gemara emphasized the fact that since a condition was made that the lulav and esrog need to be returned after the user has made his bracha, he has to return the lulav and esrog. And if he doesn't, it's not just he's a ganav, but that the mitzvah he thinks he's accomplished is taken away from him, abrogated from him, because the whole basis of him gaining possession was that he would eventually give it back. If he doesn't give it back, then the conditional gift is void, which means that when the person made a bracha, it wasn't his own to make a bracha on. So the future, whether he will give back the lulav and esrog, will determine the past, or determines what has already happened. He's made a bracha on it. If he gives it back, then that bracha will end up to be invalid and he will have done the mitzvah. If he doesn't give it back for whatever reason, it will invalidate the mitzvah that he might have thought he's already done, because it's a matana al manas lahachzir. It was a conditional gift. Of course, you can make an outright gift. If you want to make an outright gift, there's nothing wrong with that as well. You just, it's easier if I do this. You can make an outright gift, but then it'll be up to the user to give it back to you. If he wishes to, he won't have to give it back. But if it's a conditional gift, he has to give it back. And that becomes, the fulfillment of that condition then determines whether he actually has fulfilled his mitzvah.
Excuse me, what do you do if they have a synagogue lulav and it's lying around? Do you say anything before you say the bracha? Or it might be somebody's. You don't know who it is.
Well, no, if it's not the first day of Sukkot, you have no problem.
Right.
Except that you might be using somebody else's lulav and esrog. There's a question as to whether you should make a broch on somebody else's. Maybe it doesn't want you to make a broch. That's another matter. But halachically, it doesn't need to be yours on the first day of Sukkot. Then really you should only take it from a gabbai or someone who has some sort of title over it. Tosfos this thing that if you've all brought in shutfus, and you've got the right frame of mind, one person can abrogate. Everybody can abrogate their ownership in favor of the person who's using it now. But the normal situation is that the shul has bought it and trusted it to some individual, maybe. That individual then should give it as a matana hachzit to as many people as needed, and that could be a lengthy process.
Could you assume that you're a friend, that I'm a friend of yours, or I know you? I know you, of course.
Not at all. No, there's no friendship content over here. Something either belongs to you or it doesn't belong to you on the first day of Sukkot. It has to be lochem. It's not a matter of, here we're not talking about whether a person, would be makpid, as they say, that he would be particular if somebody used his lulav nesek. On the first day, it's more serious than that. It's a question of, do you have legal title to it or do you not have legal title? And incidentally, by the way, there would be some questions then. If you bought, shall we say, a lulav and esrog on credit, there might be quite a question mark as to whether you're allowed to make a bracha, at least on the first day, because it's not lochem. Again, possession has to be absolute over here. You can donate possession, even on this matana naslach here, but you're doing so as a full possession transfer to the individual until he's done his mitzvah. Okay. So the first day of Sukkot is a serious state of affairs, really, in terms of ensuring that you are using a lulav and esrog legitimately. The Gemara went on to give us some lovely minhagim in Yerushalayim. So in Yerushalayim, they used to go out of their home and they used to carry the lulav and esrog with them. And they only used to put it down when they were reading in the Torah or if they were duchening, or they were learning intensively, but otherwise they would take the lulav and esrog with them all the way, just as you would take your mobile phone around with you, and your phone in your pocket, they would be taking their lulav and esrog with them, in hand, so to speak, throughout the day, and indeed throughout all of Sukkot, throughout all 7 days. That's not just a first day thing. And this is to do with the chavivus of a mitzvah, that a mitzvah is beloved to a person, and it's something which is with them. Their connection with a lulav and esrog is something they feel, and they wish to make those feelings, express those feelings, and you carry the lulav and esrog around with them. So that used to be a minhag, although we see very little of it. There's still a few in Yerushalayim who do it today. So that's really the content really on the first part of the Mishnah. Now the second part of the Mishnah, which is really where we are going to go forward on today, on the discussion of that second part, was slightly more technical. So the second part of the Mishnah told us this, that if we look at the normal case of a person who carries out an avera, let me start from the background. If a person carries on Shabbos when he shouldn't be carrying on Shabbos, he's over, he transgresses on an av malacha, on a forbidden one of the forbidden 39 av malacha that he's not allowed to do on Shabbos. If he does so for not realizing what he's done or not realizing it's Shabbos, making some sort of error, then obviously he's not going to be liable to a punishment in Beis Din because it was a mistake. However, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, he used to have to bring a korban chatos because it's a serious violation. And therefore, Shabbos is a very serious violation when you violate any of the 39 av malachot. And he would normally have to bring a kapara, an atonement for his violation. Even a violation unintentionally is a violation, and it's counted against him, and he needs a kapara. That would have been a korban chatos, a sin offering. He would have brought that when he could to the Beis HaMikdash. The korban chatos is slaughtered in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Kohanim get some of the food of the korban chatos, some of the meat, etc. And the owner of the korban, when it's on the mizbeach, he gets a kapara for his aveira b'shogeg, his unwitting violation. The Mishnah said to us that if the violation was carried out in the pursuit of a mitzvah, then the violator doesn't have to bring a korban chatas because it was in pursuit of a mitzvah. So what was the case? The case in our Mishnah was a case of lulav and esrog. We said that you shouldn't take your lulav and esrog out on a Shabbos in a street if there's no Eruv, which is why they had to bring it to the Beis HaMikdash on a Friday afternoon when the first day of Shabbos, first day of Sukkot falls on a Shabbos. They brought it, or any day, they would bring it on the Friday afternoon so they would have to carry it the next day. However, supposing the person in his enthusiasm, it was a Shabbos, in his enthusiasm, he had the lulav and esrog in his hand because he's very closely attached to his lulav esrog. It's the third day of Sukkot. He's been carrying it everywhere. And without too much forethought, he carries it out into the street and there's no Eruv. And so he is in violation of carrying on Shabbos. You shouldn't carry a lulav and esrog or any object out into the street on Shabbos. He's in violation technically. However, the violation in this case was in pursuit of a mitzvah. What does that mean? He was holding a lulav and esrog. He wasn't holding a plastic bag. He wasn't holding his favorite novel or something that has no attachment to a mitzvah. He was holding the mitzvah of the day. The mitzvah of the day on Sukkot, even if it's a Shabbos, it used to take lulav and esrog. He used to make a bracha. And he hasn't yet made, as we'll see in a moment, his bracha on the lulav and esrog. So when he takes it into the street, he's doing so because he wants to take it to shul, and he wants to then make a bracha in shul, the lulav and esrog, and he wishes to say Hallel with a na'anunim, with all the shakings, etc., etc. That was in his mind when he went into the street, forgetting it was Shabbos. Under those circumstances, the Mishnah told us that the violator, because he took it into the street on Shabbos, does not have to bring a korban chatas. That korban chatas, the need for a kapara is waived. Why is it waived? Because he was not doing this with an object that had no secular value. He was doing it with an object of mitzvah. And when you violate with an object of mitzvah, you were trying to do a mitzvah, if you like. But in the trying to do a mitzvah, you actually over an aveira, then you do not have to bring a kapara. I mean, if you like, from a straightforward balabatisha point of view, it makes sense. If I violate an aveira, and I do so with, even if it's unwittingly, but with no potential mitzvah product, then I really have done something very naughty, and I need to bring a kapara, a korban chatas. But if I violated an aveira, but had good intentions, well, I didn't realize I was violating the aveira, and I had a beloved mitzvah in my hand. So there, if you like, the Gemara says you don't have to bring a korban because your violation is a little bit less serious, because you had in mind the intention to do a mitzvah. It happened to lead to a violation. That's still somewhat negligent, but it is not as negligent. You had the enthusiasm of the performance of the mitzvah in your mind, and then you carried it into the street. So that violation doesn't require you to bring a korban chatas. In other words, you don't have to bring any kapara at all. You shouldn't have done it, but there's no need to do any act of restitution. That's what the second part of the Mishnah said. So it was, if you like, a complication in carrying on Shabbos relating to a person who's carrying for a mitzvah. Now, the Gemara is going to bring some other examples. This is not the only known example to halachic man of a person violating an aveira while in the throes of doing a mitzvah. There are bound to be other cases as well, and the Gemara is going to bring some other examples. I'm going to take this up from the Gemara, which is actually, I mean, I attached, if you look at the emails I sent out, a sheet which is 42A, Mem Beis Amud Aleph. The last few lines, last line actually, on Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, 41B, is where it starts. But I didn't attach that one again because there's only about 3 words to read there. And it relates to the second part of the Mishnah that if you're carrying in the throes of doing the mitzvah, lulav and esrog, you want to take it to shul, and you carry it through the street on Shabbos, you would not have to bring a korban chatas. So Rabbi Yossi says that was Rabbi Yossi's halacha. Rabbi Yossi made that; it was in his name. So the Gemara says 2 words on the sheet that are not attached. Omar Abaye. Now we already on the top of the next sheet. Lo shanu, the sheet that I actually attached. Abaye now makes a chiluk over here. He makes a stipulation. It's a stipulation I already mentioned here, but it only appears actually for the first time on the page. And I introduced it, if you like, prematurely. Lo shonu, when does Rabbi Yossi say his din? That what? That you don't have to bring a korban chatos if you carry out this lulav and esrog because you want to do a mitzvah. He only says it, ella shalo yotzabo, when the person who's taking out the lulav and esrog has not yet fulfilled his mitzvah on lulav and esrog. He hasn't yet made a brocha and shaken it or done whatever he needs, as we'll see in a moment, to fulfill the mitzvah. Aval, but yotzabo, if he's already fulfilled the mitzvah of arba minim, what does that mean? It means even before he opened the front door to go to the street, he made his, shall we say, his bracha of lulav and esrog at home. And he only wants to take it to shul because everyone's going to shake their lulavim around for Hoshanas, etc. So that's already more rabbinic. That's really not a mitzvah in our Torah to do that. He's already fulfilled his basic fundamental law of arba minim at home. Now he walks out. Having already fulfilled it, chayav, the halacha would be different. Rabbi Yossi would say you would have to bring a korban chatos if you walk into the street in that situation. So Rabbi Yossi has made very clear there's a distinction. The waiver that one does not need to bring a korban chatos when one takes one lulav and esrog out into the street on Shabbos, it's only if you haven't yet violated the mitzvah. You haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. Only then can you be said to be involved in the mitzvah of lulav and esrog. Why? Because you haven't done it yet. However, sorry, can I just finish a second? Then you
yes, sorry, yes.
However, if you have already been mekayim the mitzvah lulav and esrog, and then gone through the front door, even though it's still sukkos, and a lulav and esrog is still a nice thing to carry around, and you want to do the na'anuim in Hallel, and you want to do the Hoshanas at shul, that is already not considered to be being involved in the base mitzvah. You're being involved in the fringes of the mitzvah and not the base mitzvah. So now when you carry it out, you're treated as if you were carrying out a plastic cup of coffee. It isn't a plastic cup of coffee, but as far as the mitzvah is concerned, you've done the mitzvah in your lulav and esrog. You have no more reason to take your lulav and esrog out minat Torah. So therefore, you're not considered to be osek the mitzvah anymore. And then you will have to bring a korban chatos. That is, Abai is putting this in as a chiluk in Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi didn't tell us this. Rabbi Yossi didn't give us this distinction. And the Gemara is going to question this. But the Abai says this is essentially an innate distinction. It has to be that you haven't yet carried out the mitzvah. It's not a question of just saying every time on Sukkot you can go out into the street and you won't have to bring a korban chatos just because you're holding something which is an object of mitzvah. There has to be a need for you to hold the object in terms of an unfulfilled mitzvah. Once you fulfilled the mitzvah, you're not considered to be associated with that mitzvah anymore. And it's as if you were carrying out something that was nothing to do with the mitzvah, and you would need to bring a korban chatos. That's a distinction made by Abaye. Okay, so now the Gemara asks a kasha, and it's something we dealt with before, so you might remember this. The Gemara is saying, what does this Gemara mean over here? That if you've already fulfilled the mitzvah, then you would have to bring a korban chatos. Isn't that always going to be the case? That before you've gone out of the front door, you will always have fulfilled the mitzvah, says the Gemara. And this is something we discussed a few weeks ago. Ha, mid'ad behe, nafek behe. Surely, as soon as he picked his lulav and esrog up, even before exiting the front door, he's already mekayim the mitzvah. You remember all the discussion we had about how before a bracha you take it upside down, or you have a negative kavana, because as in theory, as soon as you pick up your lulav and esrog, you're already mekayim the mitzvah. The bracha is totally irrelevant as far as the kiyum of a mitzvah. The bracha is a mitzvah of making a bracha, but it's not the mitzvah of lulav and esrog. So the Gemara is saying, fundamentally, everyone before they enter the street, exit the house into the street, has always fulfilled the mitzvah. Because in order to go out with it into the street, he must have picked it up. And if he's picked it up, he's already done the mitzvah. So there isn't going to be a case of a person going into the street who has not yet done his mitzvah, and therefore he will be he's waived from bringing the korban chatas. The only situation you can imagine, says the Gemara, is that the mitzvah's already been done before you reach the front door. That's what the Gemara says. Now, the answer is, we've discussed the answer already when we said how you should make your bracha. The Gemara answers now, Omar Abaye. Abaye says, no, that's not a kasha. What you're talking about? Kesha hafacho, which is what we do with our esrog usually, rather than the lure. But he holds it upside down. This gentleman, before he went into the street, he was clever enough to not to want to make his brach be Makayim the mitzvah at home. He wanted to be Makayim the mitzvah in shul. So he did what Art Scroll says. He took out his arba minim upside down, and only after he made his bracha in shul did he turn it the right way around. So it turns out that when he entered into the street, exited the house, he had not been Makayim the mitzvah, because you only Makayim the mitzvah with arba minim if you take them the way the Gemara describes as derech gedil osam, the way in which they grow. If you take them upside down, then, or take even any one of them minim upside, doesn't have to be the lulav, it could be the esrog, could be the esrog, could be both, or whatever it is, then you are not considered to be fulfilling the mitzvah of arba minim, even if you're carrying them physically. So the case that Rabbi Yossi was taught, where the chiluk would still be a chiluk. A distinction would be a distinction. We have a person who's taken it, picked it up while it was hafochot, was inverted. So he's not going to have fulfilled the mitzvah. When he carries it into the street, therefore, he's carrying arba minim into the streets with them prior to the mitzvah being fulfilled, and that's when he doesn't have to bring a korban chatas. However, if he turned it the right way round at home, then he would have fulfilled the mitzvah. And then if he took it into the street, he would have to bring a korban chatas because he's not involved in the mitzvah anymore. So when you don't have to bring a korban chatas is when you start off with a lulav and esrog or one of those species inverted, and then you go into the street, and therefore you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah as yet. That's the way. It's a little bit of a sophisticated solution over here, but this is the very ruse that we use when we make our bracha of lulav and esrog. That generally we hold the esrog upside down, so that we do not fulfill the mitzvah until we've made the bracha, because we only want the mitzvah to be fulfilled after we make the bracha. So this is the same consideration. I also mentioned to you some other possibilities, like having a negative kavanah, if you remember, that you could take it even the right way around. If you had in mind that I'm carrying this, but I have no kavanah to be yotze. The Gemara here doesn't mention this, but in other words, there are other possible solutions. And one of them is to have a negative intention, but that has to be a considered negative intention. You won't be assumed to have a negative intention. You have to hold in your mind, almost speak to yourself as you pick it up. I have no intention to be Mekayim the mitzvah. And you walk through until you reach the front and all the way to shul. I have no mitzvah, have no intention to be Mekayim the mitzvah. Well, it's easier to carry the lulav upside down than it is to carry on with that negative intention. However, in theory, a negative intention would do as well. So you have got a situation. You have two situations, essentially. You have a scenario where he can be Mekayim the mitzvah at home if he decides to take it the right way around, and he is Mekayim the mitzvah. When he then goes out into the street, he's done the mitzvah already, and he would have to bring a korban chatas for carrying it because he's not involved in that mitzvah anymore. But if he had it upside down in the way that we're suggesting over here, or had a negative intent when he goes into the street, then he will not have been Mekayim the mitzvah. And therefore, he's still involved, if you like, waiting, anticipating the mitzvah, and he would not have to bring a korban chatas. That is the way the Gemara understands things here.
I was going to ask a question. What happens either you've walked 4 amos on Shabbat outside your house with carrying the lamaz in a bag, a long bag, or even halfway to shul, are you supposed to walk back? For people might say he's carrying.
No, you're asking a mitzvah on Shabbos, really, whether you should drop it on the spot, whether you should use that. There are all sorts of different ideas over here, but maybe you should not stop at all. and just rush all the way, because every time you stop, it's considered to be a halachic new form of carrying, an akira v'hanocha. There are all, I don't want to get into, that's really Maseches Shabbos. However, you have raised a question right at the beginning. If you're carrying it in a plastic bag, supposing you pick it up on the table in a plastic bag and you went out with it, would you be mekayim the mitzvah? That's a pretty strange way of taking. Why isn't that another alternative? I mentioned the alternative, taking the wrong way around. Take in a plastic bag. It's in a plastic bag. What happens if it's in yours? The esrog is in your esrog box. Even if you take the lulav the right way up and the esrog is already in the esrog box and you carry it out, have you fulfilled the mitzvah? While that esrog's in the esrog box, you've got both of them in your hand in some way. You have your lulav in your hand. You have the 3 min in there. You have the esrog in the other hand in the esrog box. Would you then be considered? I'm asking you these questions because it's not so easy. And the very next Gemara is going to ask the same question. It's also going to talk about containers. Let's have a look. Containers or some chatzitza, some medium in between your hand and the lulav and esrog. Does that mean you're not fulfilling the mitzvah, or are you fulfilling the mitzvah? Let's have a look. Rava Amar. Rava is going to disagree with Abaye. Abaye has given a distinction, and the way he's placed his distinction is, which is the situation that you haven't yet done your mitzvah yet before you go out, when you took it upside down. Right? That was his suggestion, kishafacha, when you took it upside down. Rava says, you don't have to say that. You don't have to say that he needs to take it upside down in order to avoid fulfillment of the mitzvah until he gets to shul. No. Afilu tema, and he doesn't bring my thing of negative kavan, he brings a third possibility. Afilu tema, you could even say that we are talking about a case to avoid doing the mitzvah before you get to shul, and he didn't take it upside down. That hocha b'mayoskinen, what might be a case we could deal with that would also lead to the same non-fulfillment of a mitzvah, kagon shahotzi bichli. It's where he takes it out, not directly, but in a kli, in a vessel. Well, this is what I said to you a moment ago. Supposing, let's not talk about you could be talking about the lulav being in your plastic lulav bag, that's one possibility, or the esrog being in an esrog bag, that's another possibility. So if he takes one of the minim in a kli, says Rava, that's also good enough to avoid the fulfillment of the mitzvah, which means if he were to take them in a kli, or one of them in a kli, then leave his front door into the street, the Rishus Harabim, he would not have to bring a chatos, even though he's carrying on Shabbos. Why? Because he hasn't fulfilled his mitzvah. Why hasn't he fulfilled the mitzvah? Because he's not taken it in the way you should take it. It says with a kartem you should take. It doesn't say you should carry it in a bag or in a container. So therefore, that's another possibility Rava suggests to avoid the fulfillment of the mitzvah, to defer that until you make the bracha at shul. So that could be another possibility. It could go and show tzio bichli. This is a little bit difficult. We'll just see what he means by a kli. And what do you mean by a kli? Let's just go a bit further in the Gemara, because you can have different meanings to this. You takes it via something else. A kli usually means a vessel, but it doesn't have to be a vessel. Let's just have a look and see what's next. Says the Gemara, how can Rava say, Gemara is actually going to question Rava. Rava has just said that this would also work. His deferment of fulfillment of the mitzvah would work also if he takes it in a kli, because that would not be considered taking it. If you take it directly, it's taking it. But Rava you could also suggest that taking it in a kli would also work in terms of avoiding the mitzvah, because taking a kli isn't taking. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Did not Rava himself say, that if you take something via something else, it is taking. Here the Gemara is referring to the fact that there's actually a machlokus on this, and it's not so clear. And it sees Rava has already been quoted elsewhere as making the statement and taking the view that even if you have to take something in a mitzvah, I'm not talking about take something because someone's asked you to take something for them. If there is a mitzvah of lakachtem, according to Rava, you fulfill that mitzvah even if you do so without touching the object directly. Even though there may be something between your hand and the object of the mitzvah, that's called lakicha. According to another chacham, it's not. But according to Rava himself, he's quoted elsewhere as saying that it is a lakicha. So now the Gemara is saying, how could then Rava be consistent? He's being inconsistent. He's just said that the guy, maybe he takes it out in a kli, and he won't yet be fulfilling the mitzvah. And that way, when he carries it in the street, he doesn't have to bring a korban chatas because he's taken it in the kli. Says the Gemara, Rava, you're not actually addressing Rava. The Gemara, so to speak, thinking about Rava's position that it's inconsistent, because elsewhere he says, Lekicha, what he says, al yedei dobra acha, taking via something else, shma lekicha, is legally constitutes taking, which means it would be Mekayim the mitzvah. According to Rava, if he put it, it seems, in a bag or something and took it out, Rava's own view would be he would be Mekayim the mitzvah. And yet he's saying himself that that is a way you can avoid doing the mitzvah. Well, which is right. Rava has been, in a sense, we're saying Rava said two different things which contradict each other. One, that you could just take it in a kli and you defer doing the mitzvah. And another statement which says when you take something via something else, and that's a more general statement, if you take something via something else, that's considered legitimately and formally to be taking it, even though you're not in direct contact. And those are contradictions. So the Gemara is going to resolve that contradiction in Rava. And the Gemara says, Hanimili, no, those things, when Rava suggests that taking something via something else is considered taking, and is therefore a fulfillment, even though you're not carrying it yourself directly in your hand, that is only derech kavod. It's only if the way you are carrying that object of mitzvah, even though it's indirect, is derech kavod. It's in a an honorable way. It's a way that gives kavod to the chayfetz shel mitzvah. Then, even if you're not doing it by holding it directly, you are considered to have done it in a way in which you can fulfill your mitzvah, because you're doing it derech kavod. You're affording kavod to the mitzvah in the way you are holding it, even though you are holding it via something else. We need to discuss this, not at all clear. So before you ask a question, because I don't understand the Gemara myself, Avol, derech bizoyan, lo. But if he's carrying it in a way, my goodness, what's happening to me here? If he's carrying it derech bizoyan, if he's carrying it in a way which is, in a sense, an affront to the mitzvah, or not dignified to the mitzvah, then he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah at all. So let's just talk and think about what this means. And I have to tell you, I am puzzled myself because I have various questions on this. The Gemara means to resolve the contradiction Rava. Let's first of all see what the Gemara thinks it's achieved by this before deciding whether it makes sense or not. The Gemara thinks it's achieved a reconciliation between these two statements of Rava that seem to contradict. And the reconciliation to say there are two different situations. There's a situation where when you carry the chayfetz shel mitzvah via something else, it's considered as if you carried it directly. That's when he says that when he said taking something, even though you're not taking it directly, but only via something else, it's considered to be taking it. That's when a person takes it derech kavod. However, when he said about the guy who leaves the front door and he takes his lulav and esrog and goes through the street, he says, if he were to take in the kli, then he would not be fulfilling the mitzvah. That's a situation where the kli was not derech kavod. We didn't say so, but this is the way the Gemara is learning it. There was not derech kavod. So, for example, he had in mind that the person leaving the house doesn't take it out in a dignified manner, but he takes it out in his local, Harrods shopping bag, right? He takes out the lulav in the Harrods shopping bag into the street, and therefore he's not going to be considered doing the mitzvah. If he'd been taking it in a real honorable manner, he would have done the mitzvah as soon as he picks it up. But if he takes it out into the, if he picks it up before going into the street in this non-mitzvah dignified manner, then he's not considered. So that will be a distinction. How do you take it out? Do you take it out in a dignified manner? The word dignified isn't right over here. I would say in a way which is befitting the status of the mitzvah. If you do so, then you are considered to be fulfilling the mitzvah, even though you haven't taken it directly with your own skin, so to speak. However, if you take it out in a way which is not befitting the status of a mitzvah, then you are not considered to be fulfilling the mitzvah. You're not considered to be carrying it directly. Now, there are some questions over here. There's some real questions over. We've sort of resolved the situation, but what is derech kavod? Let me ask you then. Supposing you have a silver esrog box, Louis XIV, right? So I don't know, the finest stuff that has come from worth $1 million, and your precious esrog is in there. And you take that esrog, you've got the lulav the right way around, but you're taking the esrog out, as so many people do, into shul, and you're carrying it out the house. You're holding this esrog box in your left hand, this precious $1 million worth of silver, and you're holding the lulav in the right hand. Which of these two scenarios do we ascribe this to? Do you say this is a derech kavod? I've never heard anybody ever say that by going out into the street with a beautiful esrog box and your lulav that you are mekayim the mitzvah. But when I read this Gemara, it seems you are. It seems that since you're taking out the derech kavod, what could be more derech kavod than in a silver esrog box? Let me ask you. I can't think of anything more derech kavod. And yet I know you're not mekayim the mitzvah. At least we don't hold that to be the case. So are we saying we don't hold like Rava? It could be because we don't hold like Rava. Or it could be, and I'm seeing some of the interpretations over here, talk about a distinction between putting something into a container and taking something with a pair of fine white gloves, for example. We could be talking about a situation where you, derech kavod would be to take it, for example, I see some of the early Rishonim talk about in a silk scarf, that if you hold the lulav in your hand, not directly, but you wrap a silk scarf around it or some other valuable fabric, not a shmata, because that would be low derech kavod. But if you put a silk scarf around your hand and carry the lulav, that would be derech kavod. Robert would say there you're mekayim the mitzvah. However, if you had a shmata around your hand when you took it out, that would not be derech kavod and you would not be mekayim. And I'm really not sure where the esrog box fits into all this, because I don't think 2,000 years ago they really had silver esrog boxes. You know, this is before all these the fine silversmiths were working. So they might have had clay, but they wouldn't have put anything into, they wouldn't have put an esrog into a clay box or anything like that. So we don't have an entire parallel. But the Gemara has ended up over here and making a distinction between, for Robber's purposes anyway, that he would consider taking something out in a dignified, befitting fashion, even via a container possibly, or via a glove, to be fulfilling the mitzvah, even though you're not holding the lulav and esrog directly. However, if you did so through some non-befitting method, it would not be considered fulfilling the mitzvah. And therefore, you've got options. How do you take out your lulav and esrog before you go into the street? If you want to look over here, we're talking about a person making a mistake. But if a person takes it upside down and he only means to fulfill the mitzvah at shul, then he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. According to Rav, if he takes it out into a dirty plastic bag, so to speak, he also hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. There's also the possibility that he has a negative kavanah goes out, he hasn't fulfilled the mitzvah. In all those situations, he will not have to bring a korban chatas because he's still engaged prior to the mitzvah. However, if he deliberately fulfilled the mitzvah at home, taking it the right way round, whether he makes a bracha or not is immaterial, but taking the right way round, and certainly if he takes it directly in his hands, then when he goes into the street with it, he violates the Malacha and Shabbos, and he would need to bring a korban chatas under those circumstances. Okay. All right. Now the Gemara is going to move on to an aspect that we just discussed, which is this general rule we said that if a person violates a serious avera that he would normally have to bring a korban chatos for, a sin offering, but he does so in the pursuit of a mitzvah while he is engaged in the mitzvah, that he doesn't have to bring a korban chatos. That principle, forget about whether it's a lulav or an esrog or anything else. We will see other examples now. You know, it sounded right, and I gave you a feasible explanation that the guy who does so while he's in the pursuit of the mitzvah, you know, at least he's got a mitzvah in mind. Why should he need a kapara, even though he's gone into the street? After all, he started off with such good intentions. But someone is just carrying out a plastic cup of coffee into the street, even if it was a mistake. He doesn't have the defense that he was engaged in doing a mitzvah. So therefore he has to bring a korban chatos. That was the halacha which was brought in our Mishnah as well in the specific case of lulav and esrog. But the general rule is one, that you can avoid a korban chatos if you were involved in a mitzvah, when you violated unintentionally on some other avera. So let's have a look. Omer Rav Huna, Omer Hoyer Rabbi Yossi. Rav Huna is saying something, and the Gemara is going to see whether this is consistent with the statement of Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi used to say, actually Rav Huna doesn't really know what Rabbi Yossi used to say. They're separated by over 100 years, maybe 200 years. But he means to say that Rabbi Yossi would say this based upon his normal line of thinking. Often you say someone says something in the name of someone else. This is not such a situation because he wasn't a Talmud of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Huna was Babylonian Amor and Rabbi Yossi was Eretz Yisrael Tanner, and they lived at different times in different places. What did he used to say? He would say, Olas ha'of, just say the words first and then we'll discuss it. Olas ha'of, the burnt, a bird which was meant or destined to be a burnt offering. Shenimtzas bein agafayim, which has been found in the Azara of the Beis HaMikdash between other birds that are ready as korbanos, to be offered up as korbanos, ukasavur, and the person, the Kohen, we're only talking about a Kohen, who picks up this bird he finds amongst the others, he thinks, chatos ha'ofhi, that this is a chatos oath and not an olas oath. He makes a mistake. Potter, he does not have to bring a korban because he had the best of intentions. Okay, so let's talk about what the case is. This is a Zavochim Inyan, doesn't come from us at all, but the same principle will emerge from here as the one we're looking at, and we will see whether it appears to be in compliance. This is Rabbi Yossi's opinion we're quoting again. It was Rabbi Yossi who gave us his opinion about carrying out lulav and esrog by mistake into the street on Shabbos in our Mishnah. So it's the same Rabbi Yossi. And he said in the context of Zavochim. So you know that when it comes to korbanos, there are very many types of korbanos, and there are also types of animals that are brought for various korbanos. One type of animal brought for certain types of korbanos, or an option in some types of korbanos, is a bird. You can bring a dove, for example, turtle dove, or whatever you call it, a yonah. You can bring a bird. So that often was brought in the situation of a mitzora or yoletus, a woman who just had a baby. She brought an ola and a chatos, actually. So a bird could either be an ola, a burnt offering. In other words, it could come under the category of a burnt offering, which has its own rules as to how the Kohen deals with it. Or the bird, the same looking bird, not a bird that looks different, could be bought optionally as a chatos, as a sin offering in certain other situations. These are two different categories of offering, but a bird could be brought for either. There's a major difference between an ola and a chatos. Whereas an ola is fully burnt up on the mizbeach, which means that they pluck up some innards from it and then they, after it's been shechted, and then it's put on the mizbeach, it's fully burnt up. No one, not even the Kohanim, have any share. It's olah which goes up, it's kulula Hashem. It's completely goes up, if you like, in smoke on the mizbeach. That's an olah. A chatos is different. You shech the chatos, some of the rules about applying the blood are a bit different, but let's not get into those technicalities. But when it's put onto the Mizbeach, parts of the animal, whether it's an oaf or a behemoth, are available to the Kohen to be eaten. It's not a burnt offering. Only certain bits go on the Mizbeach. The rest is eaten by the Kohen. Two different halachas over here. And therefore, when a Kohen has an oaf, a bird presented to him, and he wants to go through whatever procedure he needs to go through, he needs to know, is this a bird that is destined to be a chatos, or is this a bird that's destined to be an olah? And of course, the person who brought it to the Kohen is interested that the Kohen does the right thing with him, right? If you bring something for repair, whatever it is, if you go for an operation, for an appendectomy, and they take out your tonsils, they've done the wrong thing. And therefore, if you bring a bird to the Beis HaMikdash for a kapora, for a chatos, and he sends it up as an olah, you've not received a kapora. This is not just a thing for the Kohen, it's for the bailim. The owners of the birds must be assured that the Kohen knows what he's doing, that he's taking out the right tooth, so to speak, and not the good tooth. Over here, there was a big error made. You had a Kohen, and he's busy doing various different types of korbanos. And it seems the way the Rishonim explain this, interesting case, is that there were already a number of birds, and they were already dead. They were ready for the next stage of going on this Mizbeach. And the korban sees a number of these birds. And sometimes it's just possible that two types of birds, an olah and a chatos, could be mixed up. And there's nothing to distinguish between them. So he goes to where he expects to find a chatos. And he, in order to do the chatos ceremony, but by mistake, he picks up a bird that should have been an olah. So what's the consequence of that mistake? The consequence is that the Kohen goes through the wrong procedure. He thinks it's a chatos. So what does he do? Because it's a chatos, he puts a few bits and pieces on the Mizbeach and he eats the rest. But actually now someone tells him, no, that bird was meant to be an olah. That was meant to be an olah. Now there are consequences as far as the owner is concerned. He may have to bring another bird. But what has the Kohen done? The Kohen, according to the halachos of how korbanos are brought, has transgressed on something called the me'ilah, the hekdesh. He has had benefit from something that he should not have had benefit because it is sacred for some other purpose. This was sacred for the Mizbeach, fully. And he has had and eaten some of the meat that should have been offered up, kula LaHashem. He made a mistake. He didn't do this deliberately. It's again like the person carrying out the lulav and esrog into the street, forgetting that it was Shabbos. So this was an innocent mistake, but it has consequences. And the consequence normally is that if there's a mistake with a korban and the Kohen does the wrong thing, that he has to bring himself a korban me'ilah, as a kapara. He needs a kapara because he made a mistake. He ate from something he wasn't allowed to eat. So he should have to bring a korban me'ilah. But says Rabbi Yossi, here, he's potter from bringing a korban me'ilah. Why? The same principle as in our Mishnah. The Gemara wants to say this is consistent because even though this Kohen made a mistake and he ate of meat he shouldn't have eaten, and he should, in the general case, bring a korban me'ilah because he has abused something in hekdesh, since his abuse was in the process of a mitzvah. In other words, he thought that this was an olah. He didn't just take a bird that should have been a chatos when he was doing nothing else and take it home for his family to eat. That would be me'ilah, and he would have to bring a korban. But here, what was in his mind? His mind was, I'm going to be mekayim the mitzvah of korban olah. It was a mistake, but he was a mitzvah. And since he was involved in a mitzvah, in other words, he thought that he was doing the right thing to fulfill a mitzvah, he doesn't need a kapara. And this is the analog the Gemara wants to say. In other words, parallel to the case of our Mishnah. The person wanted to be mekayim his din of mitzvah and lulav and esrog. By mistake, he took it to the street. Since he had in his mind the fulfillment of a mitzvah which he hasn't yet fulfilled, He doesn't have to bring a kapara, even though he takes that lulav and esrog into the street on Shabbos. Here the parallel is the Kohen eats part of the meat of this bird, which he thought was a chatos. He is in violation, like the person taking out the lulav and esrog out to the street. But like the person taking the lulav and esrog out into the street, who thought that he was going to do a mitzvah with, it was his mitzvah object, the Kohen here thought this was the object of his mitzvah, that he was being involved in a korban olah, in a korban chatos, sorry, that's why he ate it wrongly. So he was also osek b'mitzvah, wrongly. He made a mistake of which mitzvah, but he was certainly osek in the doing of a mitzvah, and therefore here also he is going to be exempt from bringing a korban me'ilah. It's not a korban chatas, but a korban me'ilah for his mistake. So here the Gemara wants to show, in a sense, at this point, that there is a parallel, and where a person is doing another mitzvah and he makes a mistake and he violates an aveira, he doesn't have to bring the normal korban to mechaper for the aveira, because in a sense he's got a zechus that he was involved in a mitzvah. Why should he bring a kapara? That's a simple way of understanding. So the Gemara actually is surprised. The Gemara, if you like, the line of the Gemara now is even to be surprised that Rav Huna brings this case, because the two cases the Gemara is taking at this moment are in directly parallel. So what's the news? What news are we learning here, says the Gemara? Let's just read the words. Maika Mashmalon. What is this additional case, this case of the Ora and the Chatas teaching us over and above what we already were taught in the Mishnah and Rabbi Yossi? The Gemara doesn't like unnecessary. Sometimes the Gemara does actually say, I'm bringing you a proof to something. But over here, the Gemara doesn't say, I'm bringing you a proof. Rav Huna comes along as if he's mentioning something a little bit new, which will give us additional information. Comes the Gemara back and says, there's no additional information. It may be a different case. But the lesson we learn from it is exactly the same. That if the ta'ah b'dvar mitzvah potter, that if you make a mistake, ta'ah, while you're doing a mitzvah, patur, you're exempt from being a korban. Our Mishnah said that in the case of the lulav and esrog brought into the street on Shabbos. Rav Huna is only saying the same thing using a different scenario with the chatos ha'of and the other ha'of, but it's exactly the same rule. The Kohen was involved. He thought he was still involved in the mitzvah, and therefore, even though he did an aveira, he did the wrong thing and ate from the meat. He's going to be exempt. That's exactly what Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah. Where is there anything new and additional? Answers the Gemara, there is something new here. Because Mahu de Tema, you might have thought that Hossam hu de Tar b'dvar mitzvah potter, when Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah that the person taking the lulav and esrog into the street, that he was involved in a mitzvah, that he is potter, I might have thought that is only in a situation just like that of a mitzvah, hainu to ovad mitzvah. That's where he eventually does fulfill the mitzvah. When he gets to shul, he will make a bracha on the lulav and esrog, and he will fulfill the mitzvah. He didn't fulfill the mitzvah the time he went into the street, that's true. So he has to bring a korban, so he doesn't have to bring a korban chatas, but he will eventually fulfill the mitzvah, will he not? The lulav and esrog wasn't taken away from him and disqualified. So he will eventually fulfill the mitzvah. So there I may think he's going to be potter from a korban, because he's going to do a mitzvah. The mitzvah he wanted to do, that he had in mind to do, will be accomplished. However, the case of the chatos ha'of and eros is different. But here, the tar b'dvar mitzvah, where he makes a mistake also because he ate when he shouldn't have eaten of the flesh of this bird, but v'lo avad mitzvah, and in the end he accomplishes no mitzvah. Emolo, I might have thought that he should have to bring a kapara, a korban me'ilah. Kamash milon, that we make no difference. Let's just understand this again. The first cases of our Mishnah is quite clear. This man, he hasn't fulfilled this mitzvah of lulav and esrog before he goes into the street. So he's osek b'mitzvah, a mitzvah not yet done. He doesn't have to bring a carbon. And there's good justification to say he doesn't have to bring a carbon, because eventually he will do a mitzvah with his lulav and esrog. So it turns out that when he was walking in the street, even though he hadn't yet fulfilled the mitzvah, he was on his way to do a mitzvah which he will successfully accomplish. So therefore, he doesn't have to bring a carbon. That's the way the Gemara understands that now. However, contrast that with the case of the Cohen. This Cohen over here, he also thought he was doing a mitzvah. What did he do? He ate from the meat of this carbon and put a few other bits and pieces on the mizbeach. He ate from the meat. Now, normally eating from the meat is also a mitzvah, but he shouldn't have eaten in this case because it was really an olah. This bird was destined to be completely burnt up, so he never did the mitzvah of the olah. Now, at the end of the day, when this Cohen is eating the meat, is he destined to complete a mitzvah? The answer is no. He's only doing an avera. There's only two possibilities here. Either this is going to be a successful chatos or a successful olah, and neither of them are successful because he eats of the meat. That was meant to be an olah, this particular animal, and therefore he's failed to bring the olah. He's treated it as a chatos. You can't say he gets brownie points as if he's brought an olah. He hasn't. He was meant to put it all on the mizbeach. He didn't. So what did he do? He didn't accomplish the bringing of a olah. Well, has he accomplished chatos? Of course not, because this bird was never meant to be a chatos. The fact that he treats it like a chatos doesn't mean it's a chatos. He ate it, but he ate it and he shouldn't have eaten it. So it turns out the Kohen is destined not to do any mitzvah at all with this bird. And in other words, he's only violated with this bird. Unintentionally, but he's only violated. So you might have thought, since this Cohen is not going to accomplish a mitzvah at all with his oath, therefore he should bring a kapara, because he's essentially not done anything good at all. He's done no mitzvah at all. Maybe he should bring a kapara. I understand why the guy taking the lulav and esrog into the street doesn't have to bring a kapara, because at the end of the day, when he gets to shul, he'll shake his lulav and esrog, make a bracha, and he'll do a mitzvah. So maybe that's the reason he doesn't have to bring a kapara, he doesn't have to bring a carbon for his carrying. But over here, to say you shouldn't have to bring a carbon, maybe it's much more difficult to say that, because this guy at the end of the day is not going to do a mitzvah at all. This Cohen has done nothing but an avera, and therefore, since he's done nothing but avera, he needs a kapara. Surely he needs a kapara. So I might have thought that in this second case of the Cohen, that he would need to bring a carbon. That's why the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, he doesn't have to. We do an about term. That's the reason Rav Huna brought this case of Rabbi Yossi. He brought this case of Rabbi Yossi because it gives us new information that you wouldn't get from the Mishnah. From our Mishnah, you only know that where the end product is the fulfillment of a mitzvah, that you don't have to bring a carbon for a violation. That doesn't teach us anything about where the end product is not the fulfillment. This case Rav Huna brings in the name of Rabbi Yossi teaches us an even bigger chiddush, even bigger novella here, that even where there is the end product is only an avera and not a mitzvah at all, that he doesn't have to bring a carbon. Why? Because he was involved, at least, in the Maisa. While he was involved in the Maisa, he thought he was doing a mitzvah. So it turns out, according to this, even though he never fulfills a mitzvah at all, he was involved in the throes of a mitzvah, which were not successful at the end. That's sufficient, though. The fact that he was involved innocently in doing mitzvah, he wasn't involved in cleaning up the house. He was involved in a sacred mission. He got that mission wrong, but he was involved in a sacred mission, and that alone is enough to exempt him from bringing the carbon.
Excuse me. Isn't another chiddush that he was actually benefiting from his mistake?
That would make him more culpable. You're saying even though his culpable is actually benefits, quite good actually. The Gemara doesn't mention this because I think a chatos is something that the Kohen is supposed to eat from. Even though he does get hanoah from it, it's a din that the Kohen shouldn't let it go to waste. He's supposed to eat the chatos. It's not just a question that he's allowed to, he actually has a mitzvah to eat from the bossa. So to say that he's gained from it is no more saying that he's done his duty as he thought it was for this particular bird. Of course, it was a mistake, but he did what he thought was his duty. But it's an interesting additional item. Then here he's even gained physically. He's gained hana from it, an additional thing. Very good. Okay, we'll stop over here. So this Mishnah was a little bit more technical. Mara's going to go on a little bit more on this particular issue. I think it's quite an interesting topic in itself, because we see here over here that there is a possibility where a person violates an avera. Normally you have to bring a sin offering, but if he violates it, but he's essentially in the process, or at least he thinks in his mind that he's in the process of doing a mitzvah, he doesn't have to bring a carbon for the atonement of that violation. So that's an interesting technical get out for a person who makes a mistake unwittingly. Obviously, a person should always be in control of his actions and aware of the consequences. But being human beings, we know that doesn't always work out that way. Just stop the recording. Stop the recording.